the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. Today we are demonstrating a new recipe, one that we have never tried before. But before we get started, hello potentially to our Twitch audience. This is the first week we are on Twitch as well. Hopefully the quality of the video on Twitch, as well as the platforms we are on, is not diminishing. Obviously, it's my hope to always make this show better for you guys. So let's get started. So we're making a Portuguese sweetbread courtesy of James Beard from the book Beard on Bread, which you see in front of me. This is kind of a sweet loaf. I would say this is probably sweeter by a significant margin than our challah bread. So, you know, try it. Once you bake it, try it, see kind of what you want it with. My guess is you'll be able to use it for most things, but, you know, just keep in mind it's going to have that nice sweet touch to it. Think of it as like a sweeter cinnamon raisin bread kind of thing, but without the raisins. So that being said, let's get started. So first, we have half a cup of warm water here, and this is just kind of room temperature, microwave for 10 seconds kind of water, not very warm at all. We're going to add a teaspoon of our sugar to that. And then we are going to add 2 packages or 4.5 teaspoons of yeast to this. And for those of you who are not new to the show, or new to the show, we're just going to lightly sprinkle this on top. And then we're going to just take our fork here. We're just going to lightly fluff it. We're not trying to get anything to dissolve in here. We're just trying to mix it together a little bit so they play well together, so we don't have to worry about whether things are combined. And it won't combine, by the way. It's not meant to combine, so don't worry too much about that. And just a little bit of yeast gets on your utensil here, just knock it off. You got a ton of yeast in here, so if you lose a little bit, not a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. So we're going to cover this and let this bloom. For those of you who are new to the program, blooming yeast essentially confirms it's alive, which is really important for active dry yeast because essentially they've taken it and they've just dried it out, and you just need to make sure that it will do what you need to do. If your yeast is not actually alive and you are using active dry yeast instead of instant or fresh, and it doesn't bubble up and it doesn't kind of create a little foam on top, you need to get new yeast, or you need to switch yeast types because the yeast is clearly not working for you, and you want to make sure that before you start making a bread which requires yeast to rise, that you have a yeast that is alive, that is active, that is actually going to do what you need it to do. So next step, we are going to take, we have half a cup of milk here. I'm using almond milk, but regular milk just works fine, shouldn't matter. Either way, we are combining a softened stick of butter. So if you're taking it right out of the fridge, 10 seconds in your microwave is going to make it nice and soft. And we're just going to combine that in here. Actually, I lied. We are going to combine it in here. We are using a stand mixer today for today's bread recipe because I'm in the Northern Hemisphere and it is now in the cooler season. So it is going to be a little bit more difficult since I'm working on a stone board to keep our bread nice and warm. So the best solution for this is to work with a machine that's going to move it much faster and keep that heat up. So I've just put our half cup of warm milk, and again, 10 seconds in your microwave, 30 seconds in your microwave, not a particularly long amount of time. Oh, by the way, save this wrapper. We're going to use it to grease our bowl. So don't throw away your wrapper. It's got plenty of butter on it. We're going to use that later. Now, alongside this, we're going to combine the rest of our sugar. This will be 1 cup of superfine sugar. And just pour that in here. And again, this is a lot of sugar, right? Even when we make our challah recipe, typically it's about 7 tablespoons of honey, which is shy of a cup. So, you know, we're using a lot of sweetness in this bread. It should be a nice, lovely, sweet bread. You still should be able to use it for some savory applications, but just keep in mind it's going to have a nice sweetness to it that you don't necessarily get otherwise. So we're just going to use, I'm using a wooden spoon here. You can use a whisk, whatever you need. Just smush up our butter, combine everything together. You can use a whisk, you can use whatever you need. And essentially, this is just a kind of, this is the base of our liquid ingredients, right? We're not going to add our eggs yet, but this kind of butter sugar mix, and it's going to take a while to kind of get where it needs to be. So no worries on that one. Just keep mixing it around. Use your spoon or your whisk or whatever you have. Even if you want to, you can put it in your mixer. Although no matter how nice the butter is, it is going to be a little bit difficult to do this because the butter will just kind of slip and slosh around, and you will have butter flying all over the place. So just be aware that your butter is slippery when you do this. You can't see it, but I'm suffering immeasurably trying to do this. But anyway, just, stir to combine, make it work. Your milk is warm, so that should kind of help with some of the melting process, but it did specifically say don't use melted. It did specifically say to use warmed, softened butter instead of melted butter for this. So even if this takes a while, that's going to be okay. Not that big a deal. We're just going to keep working it until it's done. Now, if you have combined it, feel free to move on to the next step. You're going to combine your eggs into this mixture, and that you're probably going to want to whisk for. And actually, I think I'm going to switch this out for whisk. So I'll be right back and grab a whisk. Hopefully it'll make this a little bit easier. Yeah, it's looking like it's going to make it a little easier. All right. Yeah, I'm going to say we're done with our wooden spoon. I'm going to switch entirely to a whisk. It does seem like that is going to be doing us a better solid here. The whisk will also help your butter break up into smaller pieces, which will allow them to combine more into the liquid there. You can see that it's much more combined now. So just keep moving that around. All right, so once that's thoroughly blended, we're going to add our eggs. There's 3 eggs here, so let's just pour this in. And just really stir it, really combine it, make sure everything's kind of coming together. And don't worry so much what it looks like right now. It might look like the butter is kind of broken up into a bunch of little pieces. Don't worry about that. It will come together. So as you can see here, it does kind of look a little, gross is not really the right word, but it looks like the butter's kind of breaking. Don't worry about that. It should all come together. Next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of salt. It recommends a teaspoon, but you can really put in as much as you want. Not more than a tablespoon, though. It's probably your best bet. Put this away here. And then we are ready to add in our yeast mixture, which hopefully should have bloomed. Let's take a look at it. You can see we have a nice little foam top on top of our water mixture. So we're just going to pour this in here. Mix that around as well. And this is all of our liquid ingredients, guys. So this is the end of the line for liquid ingredients. We're now going to start mixing in our flour. I'll just put this, well, yeah, I'll leave that there. So it says now to add this a cup at a time. So because we are about to move on to the phase we're going to be kneading it, I'm actually going to put it on the machine and let the machine do the work. So if you're not doing this on the machine, I will tell you how to do it while the machine is going. Just give me 1 second. Let's put this here. So if you are using a standing mixer, my standing mixer is affixed with a dough hook to make sure that this always gets combined. Now, if you are doing this in a bowl and not using a standing mixer, you're just going to add these one bit at a time and you're going to slowly knead with your hands. If you are doing it in a standing mixer like I am, you're just going to take it on the lowest setting here and just until it's combined, right? You're just going to let it go until it's mostly combined, or the flour kind of looks like it's coming together with the rest of the ingredients. Then you're going to add the next cup of flour, and then the next cup of flour, and then our 4th cup of flour. Now, technically, this recipe calls for 4 to 4.5 cups of flour. I'm starting with 4 as a conservative estimate. One of the things I always say on the show is that it is much easier to dry out an overly hydrated bread than it is to rehydrate a dried out bread. So we are taking it on the conservative end. I have my flour here if I need more of it. We're going to be using more for when we're kneading or letting the machine knead, and we're just going to work with that. So it started to combine, so I'm going to turn this off and put our next bit of flour in. And again, we're adding this a cup at a time. If you want to add it a little bit more, a little bit less at a time, that's up to you. This is just to make sure that everything gets really evenly distributed before we start working. If you're kneading this with your hand, by the way, just make sure that you're getting all the way underneath your dough, because what this is going to ensure is that you're getting all the flour and working all the flour and all the liquid in, right? You don't want to pick up your dough and then see on the bottom of it, suddenly you actually have a bunch of flour or a bunch of ingredients that just haven't been well combined together. And that's never really a great sign. So we're just kind of adding things a little bit at a time. And even on the standing mixer, you might get where some ingredients are sitting on the side and kind of not playing with the rest of the ingredients. Feel free to use a spoon, a spatula, or whatever. I have a little plastic spatula here that I'll be using just to knock some of it down. So before I get going on to my next part, I'm just going to use this to push some of that flour down into the rest of the ingredients. Again, this is just to make sure that everything is getting as equally combined as possible. We want to make sure that because there isn't a ton of flour in here, right? 4 cups isn't that much compared to some of the recipes that we have made in the past, that we're actually getting everything in here. So we're just gonna keep moving that, have it on its stir setting. If you're doing this by hand, again, just get underneath there in the bowl. Don't turn it onto a breadboard already, right? Just keep it in your bowl, put your hand underneath, turn it on top of itself, and just make sure you're combining all of the ingredients. Now I'm gonna put in our 3rd cup. Just right in the middle here. Now, by the end of this 3rd cup, the dough should start to come together a little bit. So if it is not doing that, my guess is you just need to add a little bit more flour. But again, when we're adding ingredients to a recipe that has pretty set ingredients, you want to make sure that you're adding it a little tiny bit at a time, okay? Little tiny bit at a time, an 1/8 cup or a 1/4 cup at most, whether it's you're adding a liquid ingredient or a solid ingredient. This is because oftentimes bread recipes are not really forgiving. You can get away with a little bit here and a little bit there, but honestly, this is all chemistry, right? So we want to make sure our liquids and our solids and everything is combined in the right proportions. That way, we don't have to worry so much about whether it will rise properly or whether it'll bake properly and all that kind of stuff. So just make sure that everything's kind of getting combined. Your dough should start to come together at this point, even if it's not much of a coming together. Oops, wrong direction. So you can see here that, the dough is dripping, right? But it is starting to come together. You can kind of see how some of the batter is interacting with itself. So we're getting there, but we're not totally there. So I'm just gonna scrape this down and just try and get some of this flour, because I've got a bunch of flour on the side of my bowl here. And just combine that in. Remember, everything needs to combine. So do what you got to do to make sure that all these ingredients are getting to know each other, combining really well, and then you can go back to stirring it. And actually, as a just in case, I'm just going to wipe this down on here. Clean off my little plastic spatula here because we will need it later. And then I'm going to add the rest of our flour, but I'm still going to keep this on the lowest setting, all right? So just to mimic the doing this with your hand. Now, if you are actually doing this by hand, you can go as fast as slow as you want. There is almost no way that you are going to harm this dough. However, I'm using a machine, partially to keep it warm, but partially to make it easier for me. And because I'm using a machine, it is entirely possible that I overdo it on the dough. So I just need to be careful. I need to make sure that the dough is doing what I want it to do. Again, part of the way that we do that is to ensure that we're using less flour than is recommended to start with, and then adding more as the kneading process goes through. So now if you, at this point, you've added all of your flour, your dough is more or less coming together into a shaggy dough or into a decent shape. Mine is about there. I'll show you in a minute. Then it's time to move it onto your board and to start kneading it properly, okay? This is almost there. Let me show you where I'm at. Okay. Oops. All right. So you can see here, just from this particular part of it on the thing, this is a dough now, right? This is less a kind of a battery consistency. You can see that, we have kind of one cohesive ball here. So if you take a look, you can see, right, one big mass here. So we will still need to add flour to this because you can see it's quite a wet dough. But the flour that we're going to be adding now is just a little bit to keep it kneading. So this recipe is very specific about when you should add flour. They should say just enough to keep it from sticking. So we're going to really be conservative about how we add our flour to our board here. Now, if you're using a board, obviously just put the flour on the board, keep kneading. If it sticks, add a tiny little bit more flour and go from there. And you're going to want to knead for about 10 minutes. Now, for me, who is using a standing mixer, I'm just going to add my flour directly to the bowl here, little bit at a time, and just let that knead until it kind of looks right. Now, obviously, I can't tell for sure unless I either use a thermometer or put my hands in it, right, whether it's actually done or not, but we're just going to keep watching it because when it starts to look right, that's when we want to test it to see if it actually is doing what we want it to do. So it will probably not take a whole 10 minutes in the machine. It might take you 10 minutes or more if you're doing it on a board. And so just keep that in mind and just carefully. By the way, if you're doing it on a board, remember, use the palm of your hand, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back for a one-handed knead. Or if you're using a two-handed knead, you want to take that same motion, push some of the dough away, pull it back, rotate, push some of the dough away, pull back, rotate, right? And by the way, the reason that we rotate our bread, our dough every single time is to make sure that we are kneading it evenly so that part of the dough isn't poorly kneaded and some of the dough is well kneaded. We want to make sure there's a gluten development all the way through here. All right, so I want to show you my bread real quick because it is really coming along. I mean, look at that. That's a gorgeous dough there. It still needs a lot more flour. So because I'm in a machine, I'm going to add just a little bit more flour here. And I may need to get a new bag of flour up in here because I'm running out in my bag here. Not a big deal. But again, you're adding your flour little bits at a time. Now, remember, we're starting this about half a cup short of what the recipe calls for. So just keep that in mind when you're adding flour to it. It's intentionally kind of a wet dough. You don't have to worry too much about dehydrating it too much because it's starting as a really hydrated dough. And we just kind of wanted to get it to that point where it's tacky instead of sticky, where it can be easily worked, where you can do the window pane test, right, where it's kind of behaving itself the way it needs to be. Now, usually, if you hear, I would turn up the speed on my standing mixer at this point, right, to get the kneading going a little bit. But oftentimes, I'm doing that in response to a strain, an audible strain from the standing mixer. The mixer is actually not producing any strain right now, so I'm just going to leave it on its lowest setting, nice and slow, kneading this together. This is a very soft dough, guys, partly because of all the egg, partly because of all the sugar. This is an enriched dough. This is a soft dough. So don't worry too much if it seems like the dough is particularly soft or it's easy to knead or it's really stretchy and nice. Don't worry about that. That is what this dough is supposed to be. So no problems there. All right, I'm going to add a little bit more flour here. And then I'm going to need to actually get another bag of flour. Now, so I've added, this is probably about 1/8 of a cup. So we're probably about 1/8 of a cup or 1/4 of a cup above where we would have been. So don't worry about that. We're just going to keep mixing it along until it comes together as one cohesive mass, right? And again, anytime it kind of looks right, feel free to test it. The way you test it is you put your hand on it, push down till a little ball forms. You take the ball, use your thumbs and forefingers to make a little flat ball, a flat plate of dough, and you just see if you can peer through it and see the light coming through. If you can see the light coming through, that means it passes the window pane test and it is ready to start rising. Okay. The other thing you can do if you don't like that method, you can do the poke test. So if you have your ball of dough and it's feeling right, push down on it. If it comes back about 3/4 or 2/3 of the way back up, it's done. And the third test you can use, now this of course requires a tool to do, is to use a thermometer, put it in. If it's between 80 and 90 degrees, then it's likely ready to be kneaded. Okay, so Bunch of ways we can tell. I find the most reliable way is the window pane test. So that's what I prefer to use, but you don't have to use that, right? We have options here, just like I'm using a standing mixer. You don't have to use a standing mixer. You can use a board, you can use your hands, do whatever you need to do, work with the tools that you have. Obviously, the easiest way to check this is the poke test, but I find it's not particularly reliable. So of the two accessible types of tests, I like for there to be, you get the window pane test because it's very easy to do. You don't need that much skill to do it. And essentially, if it breaks before you can see light coming through it, then it's not done. It needs more kneading, right? So no worries on that. All right. So we are still in the sticky phase, right? Sticking to my fingers, no big deal. But it is a very beautiful soft dough. So we need some more flour. So I'm going to get myself some more flour real quick. But feel free to keep kneading, keep your stuff moving. And just add little bits of flour in at a time, keeping in mind that you will only need to add so much flour before it really starts to come together. And once it does that, it will be ready to rise. All right, I'm going to add a little bit of flour in here and then turn it back on and keep it going. Remember, be patient with your bread. There's a lot of things that we do that kind of sit on a timer, right? I say knead for 10 minutes, let it rise for an hour, let it rise again for an hour. But none of these things are exact, right? Bread takes its time. It does what it wants to do. So kneading, you do it till the job of kneading is done, right? And the bread is the way it needs to be. Rising, you do it until it's doubled in size, not necessarily an hour, right? We use these as convenient ways to tell you because a lot of times when you're making bread, you're busy, you have other things that you're focused on doing. And, bread makers, we get that, right? We've got other things going on in our lives. But at this point, so you can hear a little bit of strain now. You can hear a little bit of strain coming from the machine. So I'm going to turn the speed up a little bit just to get the knead going a little bit more. What was I saying? Right. So anytime I say there's a timer for something or it takes a certain amount of time to do something, just keep in mind that those are rough guidelines, right? It's not perfect. It's not an exact science, but you'll know it's done by the visual markers. It's doubled in size. It feels a certain way. It looks a certain way. It performs a certain kind of test. That's really the metrics that you want to go by, and not necessarily a time limit. That's not as important. All right, so let me show you. So you can see bread's really coming together. I can even, oops. So you can see it's really beautiful there. It does need more flour, right? It's still very hydrated. You can see just because of the way it's behaving. So we're going to put a little bit more flour in. Again, probably an 1/8 cup or a 1/4 cup. Not a big deal. If you add a little bit more than that, again, dough's looking very hydrated. And again, this recipe does specify that you're only supposed to add a little bit at a time, right? So we're going to make sure that we do that. Also, if you're using machine, if you add too much at once, your flour is going to go everywhere. So just another thing to keep in mind. If you have a lid for your standing mixer that allows you to add dry ingredients like flour without necessarily getting them everywhere, then that's something good to use here too. We're going to speed this up because I can hear the strain going. And essentially, right, you're just keeping it going until it does what it's supposed to do. It comes together as a unit. It feels tacky and not sticky. And again, if you've made bread a lot with me or you've made bread a lot in your life, you start to know what this looks and feels like, right? You don't even need my talking. You can mute me for all I care, right? And, put on music, do whatever you want. Just know what you're looking for, right? You'll know it by the touch. You'll know it by the feel. Sometimes you'll even know it by the smell. It depends on what bread you're making. But a lot of times, there's a lot of ways that you can tell that your bread is actually done being kneaded. All right, so I'm going to check ours because it's starting to look like it's coming together a little bit. Oops. I need to unlock it. That's embarrassing. Okay, so we're getting there. It is sticking to my hands a little bit, but not as much as it was before. So we're going to add some more flour here. Again, adding a little tiny bit. So this is a cup measure, right? You can see this is not very full at all. So we're just going to add a little bit here. And really, we just kind of want it to come together. And as soon as it does that, we can put it back on our board and we can kind of see how it's doing. So be patient with it. It will come together. Don't worry. And you know what's funny? Sometimes kneading can take longer in a machine than it takes on a board because you're just trying to be so careful with it in the machine so you don't over knead the bread. But you know, when you're kneading with your hands, you can just go in there, right? You're almost never going to over knead it just using your hands. But a machine works much faster than you, right? So you just want to be sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be and that you're not over kneading it. So, by the way, the reason you're not supposed to over knead things is because if you do, it's not going to proof evenly, right? So just something to keep in mind as you move forward. All right, so it actually looks like this is coming together. So this is pretty much one mass. And now as I touch it, it's not sticking to my hands any. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and I'm actually going to put some flour out here, just a little bit. And so the reason I am putting this in flour is so that it doesn't stick to the dough. And we're just going to push this down off of the dough hook. And luckily, we've created kind of a little barrier with our flour on our scraper here to help us get all the dough off without it sticking to us. Right, just feel free to get that dough off your dough hook. Put it down here. And I'm going to show you in a second because it is really pretty. So look at that. It's really pretty, isn't it? So we're going to, same thing as before, we're just going to take and we're going to bring this onto our board just for final kneading. Now, I'm not really kneading it when I bring it on here. What I'm going to be doing instead is I'm going to be just putting it into a ball and getting it ready to rise. Now, we're going to have this rise in a buttered bowl. Now, I recommend that you use a bowl that is different from the bowl that you've made this in, and I am going to do that, but you don't have to, right? If you only have the one bowl, you only have the one bowl cleaner or whatever it is, the reason, as long as you clean this bowl out pretty thoroughly, get all the ingredients and bread dough stuff out of here, it's going to be okay for you to use this same bowl. So don't worry about that too much. Not that big a deal. So let's get the rest of our bread dough off of this. And you see I'm putting my hand on this. It's not sticky at all. It's a little tacky, which is great. And we're just gonna very carefully incorporate the last little bit of flour that we have here, just to help with stickage. And this dough should feel incredibly soft and pillowy. So we're just going to I'm using my palms primarily to just move this around. I'm not doing the active ball shaping yet like I normally do. I'm just moving it around, collecting that last little bit of flour. And then we're going to test it. So let's take a little bit here. God, this dough feels amazing. I hope that your dough feels as beautiful as mine. So we're just going to see. Oh, and you can see that it's breaking right away, right? So this is clearly not done. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw it back on the machine. We're going to put a little bit extra flour in just to keep it from sticking, and then we're going to put it right back in. Sometimes this happens, right? Sometimes the dough it looks ready, but it isn't. So it's fine, no big deal. Put it back in there. Get it moving. Oops. Secure your bowl to the standing mixer so you don't have an embarrassing on-camera moment there. And push that down and secure it all together so you really don't embarrass yourself. And remember, our flour is for non-stick purposes. So, and if you want to just turn this up a little bit and get the machine really going with it, get a quick knead in there, you can do that. You don't want to keep it on this setting for too long, right? Just because you're going to deal with the obvious nature of the bread, which is to, over knead itself, more or less. Sorry, the nature of the machine, not the bread, to over knead itself. All right, so this isn't. All right, give me 1 sec, guys. Sorry. Come on. There we go. Sometimes it all just sticks to the thing, so happens. All right. So we're just letting this go really fast in the machine. I was too careful. I was too cautious, which is fine. Not a big deal. It is still staying together as one mass, which is perfect. It means essentially that we have the ratio of flour and of dry ingredient and wet ingredient pretty much exactly where we need it to be. So this just putting it in the machine is to get it to just kind of, you know, to knead it to extend the gluten fibers, allow it to be in a place where it's going to rise better. So we're just going to give it a minute to do that. And once it does, we'll take it off and we'll test it again, right? Now, if you are done at this point, and I am I'm a little bit behind you, don't worry about it, just fine. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this dough, you're going to put it in your bowl, your buttered bowl. And actually, while this is going, we are going to butter our bowl. So I have a glass bowl here. Sorry, it's a little loud. And I'm going to just butter it. Just take your butter wrapper from before and just go all around and just lubricate this bowl. And save it. Still don't throw this out because we're going to use a tiny bit of butter to lubricate the dough in the bowl. So we've lubricated the bowl now. I'm going to set my bowl aside. And we're going to save this because we'll just rub it on top real quick to get that last bit of flour on our dough when it's ready. All right, so this has been kneading for about a minute or two. Let's just see how it is. Okay, I can pretty much take it down off here without it sticking to me at all, which is a great sign. But as we saw last time, not the perfect sign, right? Not necessarily. So we're going to take a little bit of it in here. It still feels beautiful and soft, and I can play with it in my hand, and the dough's not going to stick, which is great. It's not going to stick to my hands. It will stick a little bit, right? You'll see, but that's tackiness. That's not stickiness. So we're going to stretch this out little by little. I'm going fast just because I've done it before, but you can go as slowly as you need. Also, if you do this up like this, you can let gravity help you. And there it is, our first window pane. So you can see, I don't want to put it too far out. You can see the light coming through a little bit, right? So that means this is done. So, which is perfect. We're going to take this. Come on now. There we go. We're going to take this out of here. Same one we did before. A little bit of flour on our board. Now, if you don't have one of these plastic scrapers, don't worry about it. Just flour your hands instead. And we're just gonna bring this right on out. Putting flour on it, by the way, just essentially stops it sticking to itself and the bowl as you try and take it out. So same thing when you put the flour on your fingers, you're just helping it kind of get out the way you want it to. And it leaves you with a cleaner bowl too. So that's another important thing, especially if you're planning on using this bowl for rising, which, nothing wrong with that. So you can see my bowl is essentially clean. We're just going to put that here for convenience purposes. I will deal with that in a moment. Our dough is clearly where it needs to be. We did the window pane test and everything went great. I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of flour here to incorporate this, just make it a little less sticky. And again, we're just incorporating this last little bit of flour just to remove that last little bit of tackiness. Remember, we're not trying to make it too dry, right? That's why we added our flour a tiny bit at a time through this whole process. We were super careful, right? So we don't want to mess it up now. I'm just using my palm. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hands like cups, put them underneath, and create a nice taut ball. And you're just going to pass it. You're just passing the dough between your hands back and forth until you are seeing that it has a nice firm looking top, that the dough has kind of spread out on top. It's looking nice and taut on top, and that it just really has, it looks like you jump on it, right? That's what you want it to look like. And in fact, you can use the poke test at this point to determine whether you think it's actually as taut as you want it to. I would say it's a more reliable tautness test than it is a reliable doneness test, but boop, perfect. All right, so we're going to put this in our bowl here. We're going to use the remainder of our butter wrapper just to apply a little bit of butter to our dough. This is to keep it from drying out when it rises. So you can also move it around a little bit. Now remember, it's butter, not oil, right? It will behave a little differently, so don't fret that too much. Just make sure that it looks a little shiny, and that little shininess is the evidence that it's being covered in the fat. Okay, so this is done. We've used up all the butter on this. Now we're going to cover this. We're going to set it aside for an hour, and we are going to allow it to rise, right? We're going to let it rise till it doubles in size. And so wrap it up with either a lid, not a tight fitting lid though, because it will pop off, but get yourself some plastic wrap. If you have something more sustainable than plastic wrap, I highly, highly encourage you to use that. We try and promote sustainability here, but sometimes plastic wrap is all you have on hand. And then I like to put a little tea towel on it just to make sure we keep all that heat in. Especially as it gets colder, you want to make sure that your heat is staying in your bowl as much as possible. So you want to tighten this as much as possible to keep that heat in. And you want to make sure that you've got something on top in order to make sure that that heat really stays in. All right. So we're going to set this aside for an hour. Set yourself a nice little timer. Now, if it is very cold where you are and you are concerned about your bread rising, there's a bunch of things you can do in order to make this work. One, you can turn on your oven on a very low setting and just have that heat the room that you're in. You could heat the bowl. So in previous episodes, what I've done, because I have a glass bowl, it sits at, it's just a little bit lower than room temperature. You can run warm water on the inside or the outside of your bowl as long as you dry it, right, to make sure that you don't have water incorporating in there as you go. And you essentially have a bunch of different options that you can use to kind of heat things where you are. So one of the reasons I use a standing mixer, especially as it gets cooler in the latter months of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, is because what tends to happen is that you have the marble gets very cold and everything you're doing just gets very cold. So it becomes much easier to use a machine, which will move your dough faster, which will cause more friction, and the friction will heat up the dough. So you don't have to worry so much about whether the dough is getting cold on your board, because you're not just relying on the heat of your hands to create the warmth in the dough. You're also relying on the heat of the machine that will create friction. Again, drawback of that is you have to be much more careful about how you knead, because you can over knead the dough very easily with that. And obviously we want to make sure that we don't do that. And we want to make sure that whenever we are kneading, that our bread only gets as much kneading as it needs. Again, doing this by hand, it's almost impossible to over knead. But with the machine, you have to be careful, right? So you win some, you lose some. Okay, so for those of you who are with us for the first time, this is the portion where I say to all of you bread makers who are not interested in politics, I'll see you guys in about an hour. And for those of you who came for the bread but are staying for the politics, we are about to switch to our politics portion, and I'm going to pull up our whiteboard, and we will see what is on the whiteboard this week. All right, so there's a lot here. Some of it is even newsworthy for once. I know last week it was difficult because there was a lot of stuff on there that were really old stories. So, and again, this is not a news show, right? But it's obviously, it's easier to talk about things that are in the news because people likely have the context, where opining on them then makes a lot more sense. Less explanation is needed and the like. So I actually have a follow-up to a story we did last week. So for those of you who were with us last week, we talked about a company called Clearview AI. Clearview AI is a company that spends its time scraping social media accounts for personal information, including biometrics, fingerprints, face prints, voice prints, and things like that, and handing them to law enforcement in order to help make arrests, which on its face, already very problematic, right? But it is what it is. That's what they do. So last week, they had been sued by a bunch of different small nonprofits, and they were using something called corporate lawfare to essentially put those lawsuits down by forcing these nonprofits to spend money they just didn't have, right? They were trying to bankrupt them in legal fees. And again, like I said last week, because the corporation has a ton of money, they have lots of state and local contracts, it's easy for them to do something like that. But I don't want to talk about the corporate lawfare. Clearview AI has another interesting practice that they are about to roll out to police departments across the country. And this one I actually think is much more nerve-wracking than what they were previously doing. And you're probably thinking to yourself, especially if you were here last week, how could it possibly get worse than what they were doing beforehand, right? But there is actually a way. So as you know, we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and oftentimes you're required to wear masks when you go out. Now, this has been a great advantage to people in protest movements, right, who want to hide their identity from the powerful, right, so they can protest injustice without being targeted in their place of work or education. Totally makes sense. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So left wingers, you want to wear masks. Right wingers, you want to wear masks. Radical centrists, I guess, you want to wear masks. I mean, do you really? I mean, you're just at it. Never mind, doesn't matter. So wearing masks, very normal. We're trying to normalize wearing masks, regardless of where on the political spectrum you are, right? But also, we want to normalize wearing masks because it's a pandemic, and a mask will prevent you from spreading a disease to someone else and other people from spreading a disease to you with their masks, right? We've been through this 1,000 times. So this presents a problem to Clearview AI and other companies that scrape personal biometric information from online. Now, why is this? Well, it's because law enforcement is trying to identify you through your eyes and upper face alone, right, without your nose and mouth. Now, this can be very difficult. So Clearview has introduced or is introducing a solution to this, which is absolutely terrifying. It is a predictive software that fills in the rest of your face underneath your mask to try and identify you. Now, this is problematic for a large number of reasons. First of which is artificial intelligence is only as non-biased and fair and judicious and not racist or whatever as the individual who has written it and the data it's trained on, right? So a lot of these machine learning algorithms, they are receiving training data and they pick up inferences from this training data and they make predictions based on the training data they've gotten. There was actually not too long ago a great little study about AI's predictive capabilities that I want to share with you. Okay. So I'm not remembering where it was, so I apologize. But a school essentially wanted to create an artificial intelligence that could designate the difference between wolves and dogs in images. So it got a bunch of pictures of wolves and dogs, and essentially, when the AI guessed wolf and it was a dog, the individual would say, "No, that's wrong. It's a dog, not a wolf." Whatever, right? You go through and do that. So the data, it was fed a ton of data. It learned all these things, and pretty much anytime it was fed a picture of a wolf, it said wolf, and pretty much anytime it was fed a picture of a dog, it was fed dog. And the people who created the program thought, "Oh, this is great. It's very predictive." However, one thing they realized was that the AI was actually not predicting whether the image was of a dog or of a wolf based on the features of the animal. It was actually predicting that based on the environment that the animal was in. Now, if you have a dog, you probably take lots of pictures of your dog in your house, right? Sometimes outside. But the images you take of your dog and that are taken of dogs are typically either in crates, in homes, on grass, right? Not in kind of wild settings. So the background imagery is vastly different. Now, if you're taking pictures of wolves, oftentimes you're seeing them in the wild. Either you're seeing them with other wolves, or you're seeing them in snowy backgrounds or forested backgrounds, places where domestic dogs typically don't make an appearance. So it turned out once they ran back and did some tests, that they realized that the AI was not actually making decisions at all based on the features of the animal, but instead was putting together snowy background, woody, foresty background means wolf, and couch background, lamp background, human background means dog, right? And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. But you can see now how predictive AI could start to make assumptions that don't make sense, right? Because if they're using information that is not meant to be used in order to make their predictions, then their predictions can be wrong when expanded to other contexts. Now, by the way, this has been shown true in AIs having to do with people, or things like predictive crime. Now, you can imagine that this is very bad for a number of reasons. One, because our criminal justice system is inherently racist, as are many of the laws that create crimes, right? So, obviously, if you use a predictive policing tool, it was going to look at people who are incarcerated, people who have records, and identify them to areas. This is essentially broken windows policing, but on steroids, because it's a robot saying it now, and it gives the veneer of impartiality. So taking all of this context, you can imagine where I'm going with this Clearview AI thing. It is almost guaranteed to misidentify you, regardless of what color your skin is. If it's trying to fill in the rest of your face, and by the way, from your nose down is like 2/3 of your face, right? If they're only relying on your eyes to fill in the rest of your visage, it's almost certainly going to get it wrong because there's a lot of information there to process. So this tool, which is supposed to allow police to look on surveillance video and essentially remove someone's mask or unblur an image, it's relying on guesses of what people like that look like. So you can imagine that even if it doesn't, put a different race's face on you, what it might do is it might alter your face enough to get you confused as someone else. Imagine that someone approaches you, a police officer no less, accusing you of doing something that you know that you've never done. And they say, well, we have your photo. Now, they present a photo to you which looks a little bit like you, but you can tell immediately that your eyes or mouth or something like that doesn't match up. It doesn't align, right? But they're just using a software and it just spits out a name and address, right? Provided you're in the system. So this can have incredibly bleak outcomes. And this is especially true where police are very much afraid of people of color, very much afraid of people that they consider criminals or what have you. And especially depending on what you've been accused of, this can promote things like no-knock warrants or raids or other features of the criminal justice system that are extremely aggressive and that cause many times people to be shot and killed for no reason. Breonna Taylor obviously is an example of this, not related to Clearview AI, obviously. But you can imagine that if a service like this is being given to police, then police may assume that individuals who have nothing to do with a violent crime or a dangerous crime or what have you are actually involved in it. And they may treat that person appropriately. And if and when they do, innocent people are going to get shot, are going to get killed, because police in this country are trigger happy. Unfortunately, we have not figured out yet what to do about that, and disarming them generally just seems to be out of the question. But you can imagine that a service, a software that says, we can guarantee you that we can unmask, unblur an individual's image and give you an identifier for that individual, can cause for individuals who are not involved in these things at all to be victimized in ways that they could never have anticipated. So this is incredibly dangerous. And by the way, just because we're talking about the Clearview AI predictive software doesn't mean that other predictive softwares are any better. As I mentioned earlier, predictive software and predictive AI and machine learning is only as good as the biases that we write into, consciously or unconsciously, into the machine learning algorithm. Machine learning is incredibly dangerous for police work and things of that nature because it takes the ways that humans think about each other, amplifies them through positive or negative feedback loops, and then By the way, a feedback loop is essentially the program telling itself it's done a good job when it makes an identification, or telling itself it's done a bad job when it makes a negative identification. So through these feedback loops, it amplifies it, and then it spits out what we want to hear or see or read, but with the veneer of impartiality, because the machine said it, right? The machine that operates the machine is neutral. The machine can't be racist. The algorithm can't be racist. It's just numbers, man. But what about the person who wrote the algorithm? Maybe the person who wrote the algorithm, A-OK, upstanding member of society. But what about the training data? What if the person who provided the training data had ulterior motives? What if the only training data that is available out there is actually racist because of the way that the systems that generate that data function? Most criminal justice data, especially when it's matched with AI, is going to tell you that people of color commit more crime. Why? Not because that's actually true, but because the systems that exist in the United States, where a lot of these programs are being debuted, has a racist criminal justice system. It generates racist data. So even if the people who made the algorithm, even if the people who fetched the data tried really hard to make the algorithm and the data as unracist or anti-racist as possible, it's going to be almost impossible to create a system, a law enforcement predictive system, that doesn't immediately default to black and brown people are guilty of crimes. So we just have to be careful when we're using predictive algorithms. And one of the things that we can do to prevent this from happening is to implement a GDPR-style law. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe that governs data protection and privacy. And one of its tenets is you have a right as a data subject, which means an individual for whom data exists, to not have decisions made about you, pertinent decisions made about you, consequential decisions made about you, unless with the use of an algorithm alone. So for example, I applied for a credit card the other day, and I was given a decision without having to talk to an individual, right? They just ran a credit check real quick. They checked my social security number. And in minutes, I was able to get a decision about whether or not I could have this credit card. That is an automated decision-making process. No human reviewed that, right? But a decision was made. Now, if we passed a law in the United States to say that for any decision of note, you could not have this type of processing performed on you, now Clearview AI is out of business, which honestly I think is a good thing. But it also means that in many cases where automated decisions are made about you with respect to loans or credit or other things, you take that off the table and you get a real human being to review your case. Now, that is not the case in most places. California, I believe, in their law, they have a prevention of this, and some states are catching on. But we need a federal law that does this, because it is so dangerous for individuals to have these pertinent decisions about their lives made by a machine without any human review. Now, sometimes you can get an appeal. You can say, hey, I don't like this decision. Can you have a human review it? Which in some cases will actually solve the problem, and the person will get the service that they want or need. However, in the case of law enforcement, there almost is never a chance for second guessing, because either the police kill you or they take you in and they rough you up and they fundamentally change your life. It becomes very difficult for you to do anything about it after the fact. So if we're going to have a law that prohibits this type of processing, it has to include for law enforcement, right? We cannot have predictive systems, oftentimes that are fed with racist data or created by racists themselves, putting this system in. If justice is going to be blind, and we are going to allow algorithms to help us with this blindness, then we need to make sure that decisions that pertain to individual people about what they can do and how they are perceived are not done by these machines. That's not the type of blindness we're looking for, because we know what the inevitable conclusion will be, and it is one that does not make our society any closer to being a non-racist or an anti-racist society. So I wanted to talk about a little smidgen of really good news we got out of Africa this week. So for those of you who are not necessarily paying attention to this, there is a malaria vaccine that just came out um, of Africa. It's very exciting. Now, for those of you who do not live in Africa, malaria is a virus carried by mosquitoes. It causes all sorts of problems and it kills in huge numbers. Now, the old solutions were to try and get medicines that could cure malaria once people had it and use mosquito nets, right? So to stop the mosquitoes from getting in the first place, because mosquitoes are the primary transportation vessel for malaria. And these had some levels of efficacy and such, but sometimes the medicines weren't available. Sometimes mosquito nets, they had holes in them or they were difficult to procure. The other thing too is obviously you can be bitten by a mosquito while you're out in the open, right? It's not just when you're sleeping that you can get bitten by a mosquito, as I'm sure many people who have been sitting outside all summer are aware of, right? You can get bitten by a mosquito anywhere. And in fact, sometimes a mosquito can be carrying a disease that does not exist in the area that you are in. So, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I was bitten by a mosquito and I caught West Nile virus. Now, West Nile virus does not exist mostly in the United States. So, it's entirely possible to get these diseases from mosquitoes that are sharing drinking water and are creating little kind of factories in smaller animals where malaria can grow and malaria and West Nile virus and these other diseases can grow and such. So anyway, this vaccine is headed to the WHO for approval. So let's just talk about the stats of this vaccine. So it has an efficacy of about 39%. Now, it's a little low for what we would want it to be, right? The WHO has said that they want 50% at least for a malaria vaccine, but honestly, this is just to prevent you from getting malaria. Now, apparently, the vaccine prevents you, like if you do get malaria, it does prevent you from dying, and it prevents you from getting very, very ill. So even if it doesn't necessarily stop you from getting malaria, it does keep you alive long enough to fight it off, which is a really important big step because malaria was a large-scale killer in Africa. So the hope is that these vaccines can be pumped out for free, and that they can be pumped out by lots of different organizations, and that people in Africa who are suffering from malaria or who are in areas where malaria is likely are able to get this vaccine. Which brings us back to the issue of vaccine equity. So as I've been talking about on this show for many weeks now about the COVID vaccines and the COVAX program, it's important that we think about vaccines as being necessary for everyone in the world to get, especially for diseases that spread very quickly. Obviously, in the past few weeks, I've been talking about the coronavirus, right, which we have been experiencing. I mentioned earlier in this show, we're still in a pandemic. So it is very difficult to get everyone vaccinated when there are not lots of places that can make the vaccine. And for those of you who've been following the vaccine fairness fight as far as coronavirus is concerned, you'll know that many rich countries are essentially hogging all the vaccines, even to the point where in the United States, for example, we've let millions of vaccines go bad because we refuse to share them with people who need them, right? And there are programs to try and make this better. I don't really want to go through all that again. But the reason I bring this up is now that we have a vaccine for malaria, we need to learn from the lesson of the coronavirus vaccine, and we need to allow for the formula for this vaccine to be shared with every plant that can possibly make these. Governments need to be able to acquire them in large numbers. There need to be large efforts made to ensure that all of Africa and anywhere else in the world where malaria is a huge issue, I believe there's parts of India where this is the case, get the vaccine, because we could eliminate malaria. Or if we don't eliminate malaria, we could create a situation where getting malaria is essentially as difficult as getting a common cold for a non-immunocompromised person, which is to say, it doesn't hurt you a ton. Maybe it knocks you out for a few days, but at the end of the day, you recover and you're alive. Right now, malaria is an incredible killer. And it kills fairly quickly as well. So it's important that now that we have a solution to stop people from dying of malaria and even stop some people from getting malaria, that we distribute this as quickly as possible. Now, I believe that this vaccine will likely have that effect. I think there was enough outcry from the coronavirus vaccine that people are thinking about vaccines in different ways, but it's hard to know. And truly, I don't know. But I'm hopeful that now that we have a vaccine and there has been, I was watching a conversation on Al Jazeera about this vaccine, and essentially, the people that they were talking to from different African countries was a gentleman from Nigeria was saying, "Look, 39% is good enough, right? We'll take it." So there's a obvious demand for these vaccines. So we need to now make sure that the vaccines can get to the people who need them, because malaria is so dangerous, eliminating it is really the best option, right? We were able to do so with polio and smallpox and a bunch of different diseases we were able to eliminate by use of vaccines. It would be really awesome if we could add malaria to that list. So I just wanted to share some good news and reinforce the necessity of vaccine equity. I hope that everyone who needs a malaria vaccine can get one. And I hope that either this is the end all be all for malaria, or we develop additional malaria vaccines. But at the end of the day, it's a great step forward for humanity that we finally have a solution to this terrible killer. So, you may have noticed that earlier this week, I believe it was on Monday, Facebook went down, WhatsApp and Instagram went down for a long period of time. I believe it was about 6 hours. It was the longest outage in Facebook's history. And additionally, at Facebook headquarters, people could not get in to their offices or their server rooms because everything runs on Facebook to get, all the authentication is kind of run through this same system. So people were locked out of places. So regardless of whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that Facebook went down or what have you, or you were using WhatsApp or Instagram or whatever it's going to be, it did have a huge global impact. Partially because many companies use Facebook for marketing. We are on Facebook, right? So in some ways, we use Facebook for marketing. And it was difficult for lots of people to use services that they use fairly regularly. Obviously, people who make their money on Instagram were having problems. People who need to call people around the world using WhatsApp were having problems. But obviously, this was a huge deal, and there was lots of reporting and people trying to figure out why. Now, some people have said that it looks like an internal attack. I saw that someone had said that there was issues with the code, but this has given fire to the individuals to say, hey, it's time to break up Facebook, right? This clearly shows that they're not responsible. And I'm going to make the same argument, but I want to do it for slightly different reasons. So lots of people are saying break up Facebook because, it's monopolistic, it's anti-democratic, and I agree with all that. However, the point I want to make today actually is not from necessarily a socialist point of view, but is from a data protection point of view. So Facebook is a huge company. It runs lots of services, among them the Facebook social network page, Instagram, and WhatsApp, right? Now, usually, large companies that run lots of services for millions of people have what's called redundancy. And redundancy is a technical term from the cybersecurity world that says if something goes down, there's something else behind it to make sure that it does not actually go down on the front end, right, on the front side. So think about it as like a backup generator for a hospital or your house, right? If the power goes out, you just crank up the generator and lo, you have power. Facebook should have this, right? But not necessarily for electricity because they didn't have their electricity cut. They should have this for their servers and their back end hardware. Essentially, how this typically works is Facebook, because it's a website, right? It runs on a number of servers, and these servers are stored in data centers, and data centers can go down. It happens. Sometimes the data center is on a fault line, there's an earthquake, right? Sometimes, there's some natural disaster that can take out a data center. That's fine, that's normal. It's not the end of the world. But redundancy is supposed to make sure that if data center 1 goes down, data centers 2 or data centers 2 and 3 are able to pick up the service right away. And so there's no interruption in service, at least the people who are looking in, right? Facebook users, WhatsApp users, and Instagram users. However, clearly Facebook did not do this. And this brings us to a conversation about monopoly and about breaking up companies that's important. These companies are so large that they don't really think that they're going to get regulated in any meaningful way. And so they cut corners, right? And one of the corners it looks like Facebook has cut was to say, well, we actually don't have enough redundancy. So if something happens, and by the way, it did, we don't have any good way of building back our system very quickly. In this world, there is a standard that is set for how long it should take you to get back up. And typically the maximum amount of time that it should take you to get back up after an incident like this is about 4 hours. Now, Facebook was out for about 6, which means clearly they violated the maximum amount of time that it would normally take to get a company like this back up and running. And they might push back and say, hey, we're a huge company, it takes time. But the easy counter to this is Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram should not be running on the same backend, right? Essentially, if you have 3 giant services, think about them being like 3 different buildings. Say you own 3 businesses, right? You wouldn't want them all running on the exact same set of power and backup power, because if the power got cut, then you lose all 3 of your businesses, right? You'd want each one to have its own generator, so that even if they did all go out, at least then there's another layer of security which allows you to keep your businesses, going, continuing operations, right? You'd want them to have individual protections so that each individual restaurant or business or whatever you want to however you want to think about it, continues to run, even though the main system that they were relying on, in this case, the power grid, is down, right? So in the case of Facebook, their main infrastructure went down. Okay, fine, right? Happens. But it should have been the case that Facebook, the website, Instagram, and WhatsApp had their own redundancy portions, so that even if Facebook went down, Instagram and WhatsApp would continue to be up, right? And things like that. Or the main infrastructure for Facebook went down, you could still run the pages because they were backup data centers or backup situations that you could use to make sure that nothing went down for a long time. Now, this type of redundancy costs lots of money, but obviously Facebook is a huge fucking company and they have lots of fucking money. So it's not necessarily a big cost to them to do this, but clearly because, and by the way, there are guidances and rules about what types of redundancy you should have based on the services you provide. It's a long discussion. I don't really want to get into it, but what I will say is that there are rules, not necessarily laws, but there are rules around this type of thing. And oftentimes your auditors will come in and tell you that you're not doing something or doing something, and they leave you a finding. And in theory, you have to remediate that finding. But Facebook is so large and so powerful, my guess is they just haven't been doing this, which is problematic for a number of reasons, but most importantly, because it shows they really don't care, right? And like the whistleblower said in Congress, Facebook continually made decisions that put its profits over regular people. Now, this is another instance where you could say they've done that, where they have taken what should be a fairly benign precautionary measure and just not opted to take it at all, which is obviously very problematic for everyone on the front end, like me and you, who use Facebook for our businesses or our side hustles or our hobbies or whatever, or even just WhatsApp to call people, right? I have family overseas that I call and talk to on WhatsApp. Obviously, I was not able to get a hold of them. Luckily, I didn't need to get a hold of them for any reason, but you can see how it could be problematic, right? If you needed to convey a message and you couldn't do it for 6 hours, it's a lot of time. So the point I'm trying to make here is that one of the other reasons to break up Facebook is not just because they're a monopoly or they're anti-democratic, or they are they should be regulated like a public utility, or all the other reasons you can give to break up Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg's a robot. Just kidding. He's not actually a robot. But you know what I mean, right? Like, there are lots of reasons to want to get rid of Facebook's giant stranglehold. And I just wanted to take some time to add another one. Facebook as a company handles lots of personal data. They handle lots of business transactions, and they handle lots of other information that is important for the continuing of people's businesses, hobbies, and what have you. It appears that this massive company is not interested in or unwilling to take basic precautionary measures to protect the integrity of that infrastructure. And because of that, they have proved that they are not responsible enough to have all that infrastructure at their disposal. The logical point here then is to break them up and to ensure that the smaller organizations that have that result from Facebook being broken up are required to, by law, not just by guideline, by law, to have backups for their infrastructure, so that we don't have another incident like this where essential services or important services or critical services, whatever you want, however you want to categorize them, are able to go down for such a long period of time without the public knowing anything that is going on. Millions of people rely on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp every day to do business and to do other things that are important to them or important to their livelihoods. And if it can all disappear without, any information or any recourse, it's time for the company who owns that to be broken up into smaller, more responsible corporate entities, or to just be nationalized in general. In California, this past week, there was a giant oil spill. I believe the town was Huntington, California. And essentially, a pipeline burst there. Oil got onto the beaches. It got into the water. There were, like do not swim signs put out. Animals were covered in oil. Obviously, this is a giant tragedy. And by the way, it's not necessarily a surprise when an oil pipeline leaks, because all oil pipelines are going to leak at some point, right? They're volatile. They have a lot of liquid going through them. That liquid is often volatile in its own way. And regardless of how you store this particular, regardless of what storage mechanism you use to prevent an oil spill, it is almost guaranteed that at some point the pipeline is going to break or something else is going to happen. And this is for a number of reasons. The most obvious of which is plate tectonics, right? The movement of the continents throughout the earth, right? The planet is constantly shifting and evolving and things. And if you place these pipelines underground that have these toxic chemicals going through them, eventually the earth is going to move and it's going to break, right? So just from a practical perspective, pipelines on their own are bad because, they're always going to break. There will always be a break somewhere, and you just kind of hope it's not near you and not in your drinking supply, which of course is the main frustration of many indigenous peoples who are living next to pipelines, which is oftentimes their water and their sacred lands get polluted by oil, because oil in a pipeline will spill eventually. It's a tautology. It always happens. Even if the pipeline has been going good for 100 years, at some point it will not be. Okay, it's just the way of things. So, and look, if you disagree, I'm happy to argue that with you, but it's true. It just is. At some point, every pipeline that is created that to bring oil is going to leak oil. It just will. There's really no getting around it. It's unfortunate, but it happens. So the question is, what should we do about it? Well, I would say the most obvious thing to do about it is to stop new pipelines from being built, to cut off the current set of pipelines and rip them out of the ground. If we have to transport oil which we shouldn't be doing anyway for climate reasons, but if we have to do it, at least then maybe use trucks or use trains or use a different type of transportation mechanism that is much less likely to cause massive environmental damage. So if we are going to stick with fossil fuels, if we are going to stick with oil, which again, we cannot do, it is literally killing us and our home on this planet. But for the time being, we have to be smarter about how we transport this, this liquid around. The other thing we can do, other than the most obvious thing, is we can bring back what's called the corporate death penalty. So what is the corporate death penalty? So if you think about corporate punishment, fines and things, what typically ends up happening is that a company does a bad thing, they go to court, and the court says you need to pay a fine of X number of dollars. The problem is, oftentimes, these corporations are so large and so profitable that a variety of things happens. One, the fine does not impact them at all. Two, the fine is so small after negotiation that it doesn't really help anyone. And these things create problems, obviously, because unless a corporation, well, it's like anyone, right? If you punish someone by just slapping them on the wrist or telling them, yeah, wagging your finger at them like, hey, don't do that next time, well, you haven't really suffered any for your, for your malady. So you're more likely to do it again, which just kind of an obvious, makes obvious sense. So we need to do something that will actually impact these corporations, right? And one of the things we can do, other than just arresting people at high levels of them, is to bring back the corporate death penalty. So the corporate death penalty is essentially when you do something so heinous and so bad, and mind you, look, there's not a ton of things that are going to fit into this category, right? But it does warrant a discussion about kind of what does. And I would actually say an oil spill is pretty, or even, multiple oil spills, I think is pretty good reason to bring back the corporate death penalty and to say that, look, that's actually something that you can get the corporate death penalty for. So what the corporate death penalty does is it says to everyone that's there, okay, well, we tried finding you, we tried doing these other things. Clearly, we're not able to teach you any lessons. The corporation is now dissolved. Its assets are sold off and is sheeted to the state, or in the case of an oil spill, right, the assets are sold off and used to clean up the oil spill. The top of the company goes to jail and everyone loses their jobs and the corporation ceases to exist, right? That's more or less what the corporate death penalty is. Now, if you're thinking about building a pipeline in an area that's dangerous, or just building a pipeline generally, because as I said, they will leak eventually, maybe you think twice about that, right? Because when it does leak, or if it leaks more than once, perhaps, whatever we want to make the rule, you go to prison and the company goes kaput. It's just gone, disappears, vanishes, right? Can you imagine if, now look, corporations are easy to set up. So, it's difficult to say that you would stop the behavior for very long, but at least then you have cut off the head of the snake. You make it much more difficult for that company specifically and the people at the top to do bad again, because they're in prison, the company has disappeared, and their assets have been and the assets have been gotten rid of, essentially to make sure that whoever is executing the company can use the resources to kind of clean up the company's messes. Again, because it's so easy to set up a corporation, I'm not sure how long this would solve the problem for, but essentially, if you do this, you start to imprison some very rich people. And you start to introduce real punishments into a system which effectively has been, up until this point, a cost of doing business problem. As I said earlier, because these fines are so small, oftentimes corporations just write them in their budgets, or they write a legal budget in saying, hey, we're going to spend this much on lawsuits this year, which is problematic because it obviously hasn't taken away the incentive to do bad things, right? It has only created a situation where bad things are just slightly more expensive to do. But we don't want bad things to be slightly more expensive to do. We want bad things to stop happening. And the way that we do that is we actually make it almost impossible for a company to, in good faith, say, we're going to do the bad thing. And By the way, this takes advantage of capitalism too, right? If you need to return, if you're a public company and you need returns every quarter, or you're a CEO and you're afraid of what the board will say, obviously putting the company in danger of being literally executed is going to be bad for you as a CEO. You can actually start to curb this behavior just from the threat of the corporate death penalty, or making an example out of one company, because word spreads, right? And especially, like, can you imagine what CNBC would be like if we, executed a company? That would be amazing. The word would spread so fast among rich people. Oh my God, your head would spin, right? As Trump would say. It would be awesome, because you would essentially send a very strong message saying this type of behavior, and behaviors that impact, people like this one did, will cause you to lose everything. And if you're a rational actor, that's just not a decision. That's not a risk you're willing to take, right? There is it's almost impossible to justify that, right? To say that, hey, our risk appetite is total dissolution of the company. So you force people to take more conservative positions, which is to say, maybe we shouldn't do that thing because the consequences are so high. Whereas nowadays, oh, we can do this, we can do this dangerous thing because, what's the worst that could happen? They fine us for a couple $1,000,000. We've already made billions of dollars, so there's no point. It doesn't stop them any. So anyway, we haven't had the corporate death penalty in a very long time, but I think it's about time we bring it back. And I hope that you think of the Huntington, California story, as well as other stories of corporations that have done very bad things. I would argue DuPont probably, and 3M probably deserve the corporate death penalty, as well as their subsidiaries and spin-off corporations, right, who do horrible things and pollute our water and things. And just think to yourself, what types of crimes against regular people would you want corporations to be executed over? Is it oil spills? Is it starting forest fires like PG&E did? Is it putting hazardous pollutants in our water like DuPont and 3M did? Is it painting our houses with lead like has been done for a long time? Is it asbestos, right, as Navy contractors put in ships, and all these naval officers and sailors got sick, right? There are lots of things that you can think of where large number. Is it the Sacklers, the opioids, right? I mean, the Sacklers and their company, who Purdue Pharma, didn't get the corporate death penalty. Sure, they were converted to a B corporation, but that company should have been executed, right? Everyone should have gone to prison. All the assets should have been dissolved and given to survivors. You can think of situations where the corporate death penalty would be useful in the way that I'm thinking about it. So I highly encourage you to think about it in this way, and to think about, hey, how can we punish corporations differently, right? Because if we are going to sit in this capitalist model, by the way, this may even be true in a socialist model, right? I mean, if we're going to continue to punish corporations for bad things they do, which I think we should, then we need to do it in a way that's actually going to stop new corporations from doing new bad things. So, long and the short of it, bring back the corporate death penalty. It's time. Okay. So I think this is probably going to be the last topic for today, but I do really want to talk about it because it made huge news this week. So if you are aware of what the Pandora Papers are, then just skip ahead a minute or so. I'm just going to explain them real quick. So the Pandora Papers were a journalistic project as a follow-up to the Panama Papers. And essentially, so first of all, these millions of documents were assembled by a team of about 10,000 journalists from 176 countries. So just pause and think about that for a second. This was a huge journalistic effort. And by the way, for you journalists in the United States, this is what real journalism looks like, right? It is comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, right? That is what real journalism is supposed to do. And this type of expose, the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers before it and the Afghan Papers before it, are real, tangible ways that we hold people in power accountable. Now, the Pandora Papers are essentially a who's who of who is hiding money overseas. Now, what was interesting is that there aren't a ton of Americans in this particular league, not because we're good or more financially, we pay more taxes or whatever than anybody else or any of that nonsense. It's because many people who live in the United States have such a good deal on their tax laws and shelters and things like that you don't really need to go offshore, right? You can just bribe the government here, and and we can see with our own eyes as Americans, because there are always more tax cuts for the rich. I mean, what's the one thing Trump got done? Really, the one thing he actually got done, his major legislative achievement, he gave a huge tax gift to the rich, right? So why would you need to go to the Caymans when you're essentially paying no taxes here? I mean, Amazon paid no taxes, right? All these companies paid no taxes last year. So if you think about it, you really aren't, there's really no need for you to hide your money somewhere else if you're an American member of the owner class, right? Because you just do it here. So there were famous figures. Tony Blair and his wife were listed. Shakira was in it, which is kind of interesting. King Abdullah II of Jordan was in it, and lots of other people. Those are just a few notables. And essentially, it showed complex schemes to buy real estate and use real estate as a money laundering vehicle all throughout the world. And by the way, what was very interesting about the Pandora Papers is that a lot of the places where people were storing their money were in the United States, specifically South Dakota. Very interesting. Not really sure there's a ton there, but maybe that's the reason, right? Maybe that's why they're putting things there. But a lot of this money is just being held. Trillions of dollars worth of wealth is being hidden from tax authorities. So, first of all, I just want to say that this is disgusting. And second of all, after that, we need to have a serious conversation about what we do about all this, right? Because, and as the title of this segment probably informed you, all of this is legal, right? It's almost impossible to find somewhere where this was illegal. Now, there was a little bit of a controversy, yes, about King Abdullah, and he said, look, this is my personal money. I didn't take state money. Okay, fine, right? So maybe there was a kerfuffle with private money versus public money or what have you. But the truth of the matter is, you get to a point where you realize either everything or almost everything in the Pandora Papers was perfectly legal. Money laundering, offshoring, and sending money all over the globe to avoid taxes is essentially perfectly legal in almost every country. Now, I've talked about race to the bottom politics and race to the bottom economics before, specifically in the context of an international corporate tax or an international alternative minimum tax. Now, in theory, this would help to curb this problem. But as I had mentioned in past episodes of the show, because it's a race to the bottom, all you need is for one country, like the Caymans or Panama, to decide that, we actually don't want to be a part of this global minimum tax. And so that's the country that will be used for a tax shelter. And then, of course, another country who is poor or poorer will see that they're getting a ton of money, and they'll alter their tax laws. And it's just, it's a race to the bottom, really, about who can get all this laundered money around. Another notable, Vladimir Putin, but that probably doesn't shock anybody. So it's kind of difficult to figure out what exactly we're supposed to do here, but there are solutions, right? There are taxes, but also just having individual countries reform their tax codes, right? So America now is been exposed as being a place where a lot of money is hidden. Okay, so as Americans, we can change the laws, right? In theory. Now, obviously, it's difficult because Congress doesn't really listen to us, but you get to at least use this knowledge to push for a more equitable tax law. Now, I'm sure there are people who are socialists or to the left of me who would say, well, Ben, clearly taxing has not worked, so the solution is to seize that money from them. And I agree. And it doesn't necessarily have to be through taxes too, right? I mean, in theory, you could seize that money in any way, but especially because they're not willing to give it over, right? They are clearly using all of his loopholes. They they can to ensure that their money is not being redistributed. I don't know why that was so hard. The other thing, and it's a fair argument, which is to say, well, just taxing rich puts the money back in the hands of the government, who we have seen time and time again does not use that money for good ends, right? So obviously, in the United States, we spend a gazillion dollars on our military budget every year, but we're having these ridiculous arguments about how half of our military budget per year for 10 years concerning infrastructure is a bridge too far. No puns intended. So I get it. It's difficult to say, well, we should just give the money to the government because the government will execute redistributive policies. And I hear you. I don't disagree with that. But what I will say is you kind of get to a difficult situation, because then who does the redistributing, right? So to the rich people, and look, not opposed, where does the money go after that, right? Do we just split up the money between everyone individually? Okay, sure, fine. Sounds like a great solution. But then who gets it, right? And not only who gets it, who does the redistribution, and who watches them to make sure that they're not pocketing large sums of this money and becoming a newfound bourgeois class, right? So I advocate for tax the rich because, one, in the United States, obviously it's very democratizing because we've essentially commodified elections here. But two, because sure, I don't really trust the government either all the way, right? Blind trust and what have you, trust but verify, as Reagan would say. But who else has the resources and the people power to actually effectuate this redistribution, right? It just seems like there isn't a good answer there except for government. So as flawed as government is, right, obviously, look, in order to even get these tax the rich stuff done, we'd have to fundamentally change government anyway. So I put to you that maybe by the time we have changed the system enough that we're even talking about the rich paying their fair share or paying most of their money, or maximum wages, or maximum compensation allowances and wealth taxes and things like that. Once we've retooled the government that we're actually having conversations about those things and we're actually doing those things, then sure, at that point, I would trust the government enough to do the redistribution, right? But and the government would could then be actually talking about redistribution. But that's not the world we live in right now. So we have to take the information coming to us from the Pandora Papers. We obviously have to put pressure on lawmakers around the world to ensure that national budgets, right, are not being funded by dirty money. In the United States, where we know that real estate is a huge vehicle for laundered money, we have to make sure that we are not participating in that to the extent that we are able to prevent that. We need to make sure that vacant properties are taxed, right? Because people are building these huge developments and then no one lives in them. Meanwhile, we have 500,000 people on the streets in this country, and now the eviction moratorium is up. We might have a lot more people on the streets in this country. So, and by the way, that doesn't even count for all the homeless people and displaced people in other countries. So, I think it's very important for us to think about all of this and to use this to pressure people, right? So King Abdullah II right now, he's under pressure because of the revelations here. Putin has kind of waved this aside, but that's just him. It's what he does, right? The Blair family, Tony Blair and his wife. Okay, maybe we can put some pressure on them. Shakira. First of all, Shakira, not that you're watching this, but what are you doing? Come on. You're better than this. In the words of Stephen Colbert, your hips may not lie, but your accountants do. Your lawyers do. So, at the end of the day, the Pandora Papers, like the Panama Papers before them, show us truly who's running this world. And look, this isn't about we're not getting into conspiracy theories and things, but clearly the people with the most money have the most flexibility about where to bring that money and about how to operate with that money. And look, to the libertarians out there, look, we already got open borders, right? So all this money just flows. This money flows. There's no taxes anywhere. So we can change that, right? We can make it so that if money is leaving the country for any reason, it gets taxed. And it can be taxed at a huge amount, right? There are solutions to these problems, at least within the scope of our national borders. It's going to be hard for us to change the tax laws of other countries. I get that. And it's going to be hard to, once those taxes are collected, to get the money in the right places. I get that too. But we have to start somewhere. Or the revolution has to happen tomorrow. But personally, I didn't get a call about the revolution, and you probably didn't either, because we're not organized enough as a society yet to get there. But shy of a revolution, fundamentally seizing the funds and the wealth of the rich and redistributing it equitably to all the people around the world, short of that, what we can do now as a practical matter is we can change our tax code. We can implement leavers taxes. We can implement corporate taxes. We can implement vacancy taxes for developments. We can do all these things which will help to improve the lives of individuals right now and to punish those on a real fundamental level, not on this kind of slap on the wrist level, who are trying to hoard their money in ways that allows that money to be taken away from the rest of us. And the last thing I want to say about this, in case you're rich and watching this, oftentimes we are talking about the rich generally. In this case, we're talking about people so rich who they could not possibly use this money in 10 of their lifetimes. You don't need it. Your children don't need it. Their children don't need it. This money was generated by people who you exploited, or who you exploited. And here it might not be that case, right? For artists and things who get big. But no matter what, the individuals who made this money didn't make it alone. It actually, all this wealth, it belongs to us, the people. So I agree, we have to take it back, tax the rich, eat the rich, whatever you want to say about the rich, guillotine the rich, whatever. But at the end of the day, we have to start somewhere. And the way we can start is by bringing that money back into our society, by using these revelations to create real pressure on government and lawmakers to seize some of this money and bring it back to individuals who need it most, regular people. And I don't know how we're going to get there, but we need to use this knowledge to create pressure to get on track to getting there. Because if we don't, we're just going to have another leak and another leak and another leak and another leak, until eventually we get tired of having leaks about how much money is being stolen from us as workers and given to people who are never, ever, ever, ever going to use it. All right, we're back. We have our bread here. Big reveal. It has risen. So we're going to take our plastic wrap off of here. Now, there are a number of ways to do this next spot. So regardless of what we do, we are going to divide this into 2 loaves by weight. So let's just put this on the... Come on. There we go. All right. So we're just going to... I'm just putting... I'm applying minimal pressure here to just move this dough kind of back into a ball form. Let's just make it easier to weigh. And then we're going to divide it in 2. We're going to divide it in 2 by weight. I have my scale here with the number of ounces pulled up, and we're just going to see how much it weighs. Okay, so 56-ish. So my brain tells me that that is 28 ounces? Yeah, 28 ounces each. Okay. So we are going to divide this up. Now our thing is a little, now you can use a knife. I'm using a bread cutter. What's this called? A bench scraper. And I'm just putting a little bit of flour on it so it doesn't stick when it goes through. So let's cut this up. The dough should still be very soft. It should be a little firmer, so don't worry about that if it is. All right, 23, that's a little shy of where I need it to be, so let's just add some more to it till it gets the right weight. It's probably going to be too much, but let's just see. Yeah, it's too much. All right, so what do we say? 28-ish? So that was 29 and change. It's 28.5. Can I add this to that one? Okay, 28 and change. Perfect. Okay, and just for safety, we're going to check how much this one is. Okay, so they're pretty much exactly the same size. So this is great. So now James Beard says that there's a couple things that we can do now. So one, obviously, this is going to have to rise, but there's a number of ways to do this. So essentially, there are two ways to make this. One, you can bake this in like a cast iron skillet and kind of let it and kind of rise into kind of a ball shape that way. Or what you can do, or you do what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake these in tins. So I am forming these back into balls right now. And by the way, we're going to let them rise again, just as a reminder. So I'm forming these into balls right now, just real quick. But not, I mean, it's a rough shape, right? Because we're going to put these back, we're going to put these in our tins and let them rise. So here I have two 9 by 5 by 2.5 inch pans. He advocates for 8 by 4 by 3.5 inch pans. So these are going to be a little small in here, but that's okay. Just press them down, press them in. It will rise. And honestly, you can keep rising these more or less until they fill the containers. So these are my two in here. They're going to sit in here for at least another hour until doubled in size. Now remember, as I said earlier, it is quite cool and the dough is a little cool. So if you want to create some heating in your house or unit or whatever you have, you can use your oven. So I'll probably do that and just create a little bit of heat for these guys as they warm. Let me just bring them over here. And I'll create a tiny bit of heat here. And again, I'm just putting my oven on 350, just kind of, you know, an easy thing. And it's just going to create a little bit of warmth, right? We're not trying to heat these too much. We are trying to get them to rise, but we don't want to heat them too much. So lightly drape your plastic over them, lightly drape your towel over them, just to keep that heat in. And then once they have risen to double in size, either you're going to use your 2 cast irons to cook these in your oven, or you're just going to do them in the baking tins. And you are going to, oh, sorry. So once these have risen, we have one more egg. It's off camera. You're going to whisk that up and just paint the top of your breads. So you get a nice, beautiful golden brown on your breads when they are done. And then you are going to cook this at okay, so you're going to cook these at 350 for about half an hour. Or until golden brown. Now, as I always tell you, I think the best way to do this is to tap it with your knuckles to see if it sounds hollow. But if you don't want to do that, because that test is not perfectly exact, use a thermometer and you will essentially know if the bread is ready, because the bread will be about 200 degrees Fahrenheit on the inside. So don't take it out before then. Once it's done and it's looking beautiful, whether you've kept cooking it in a cast iron or cooking it in another pan that can go in the oven, which is the way that it's suggested to do it, or you're doing it in tins like me, make sure that it's done. Once you've made sure that it's done, you just want to let it cool on a baking rack, and then it should be ready for you to eat. This has been a wonderful, soft, gorgeous bread. I can't wait to see yours. Please feel free to send an image of the bread that you baked this week, even if you didn't bake this recipe and you're baking another recipe with me, to our Facebook page at facebook.com/letthemeatbreadshow. Obviously, for those of you who are seeing this on Twitch, tell me how I did. This is the first time I'm ever streaming to Twitch. Not really sure how it works, so we're working on that. We're trying to get the show as many people as possible. Tell me if you like the content, and we will have our clips up and ready for your viewing. at 9 a.m. on Monday. Speaking of Monday, happy Indigenous Peoples Day to all of you who celebrate. Hopefully you have off from work. Columbus was a murderous moron, so that's why I call it Indigenous Peoples Day, also because it's just the right thing to do. So enjoy that. You will have your clips from Let Them Eat Bread this week that day. All right, that is it. I will have a new recipe. I will have a new recipe and a new set of topics for you next week. I would love to hear any feedback you have. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.